A cowboy bought a cow for $4. He sold it for $40. Sounds simple, right? But between that 4 and that 40, there was hell. 1,000 miles of desert with no water, 800 Comanche warriors who killed white men on sight, and a dying friend in his arms begging him to make a promise. A promise so crazy that Charles Goodnight carried a dead body for 600 miles just to keep his word. This is the story of how a broke Texas cowboy became America's first beef baron, and the invention he created along the way. You've seen it 1,000 times. You just never knew a cowboy made it. Let me take you back to 1865. The Civil War just ended. Texas was broken, farms destroyed, economy in ruins. But Texas had one thing nobody else had: cattle. Millions of them. See, during the war, nobody was managing the herds. The cattle just multiplied. By 1865, Texas had more cows than it knew what to do with. The price dropped to $4 a head, sometimes less. Ranchers were going bankrupt, surrounded by cattle. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in New York City, people were desperate for beef. They would pay $40 for the same cow that Texans couldn't sell for $4. $40, 10 times the Texas price. Every rancher knew this. Every cattleman talked about it. But nobody could do anything about it. Why? Because between Texas and those eastern markets was death itself. First, you had the Comanche, the greatest light cavalry the world had ever seen. They controlled the plains, and they did not like white men crossing their land. Then you had 600 miles of desert, the Llano Estacado. No water, no shade, nothing but sun and death. Then you had bandits, outlaws, rustlers who would kill you for 100 cattle. And even if you survived all that, there was no trail, no map, no path. Nobody had ever moved thousands of cattle across that distance. Everyone said it was impossible. Everyone said the cattle would die. Everyone said any man who tried would die too. And then there was Charles Goodnight, 30 years old, stubborn as a mule, and absolutely convinced that impossible was just a word used by people who gave up too easy. Now, Charles Goodnight had one problem. He had the skills. He had grown up with cattle. He knew them like he knew his own hands. But he didn't have money, not enough to buy thousands of cattle and hire a crew of cowboys. That's when he met Oliver Loving. Oliver was 54 years old, a veteran cattleman with money in the bank and a reputation made of iron. Everyone in Texas knew Oliver Loving. He had been driving cattle before Charles was born. Most men would see a young guy like Charles and dismiss him, but Oliver saw something different. He saw a man who didn't know the meaning of quit. He saw himself 30 years younger. They shook hands in the spring of 1866. No lawyers, no contracts, just two men, a handshake, and a dream. Oliver would provide the capital. Charles would provide the route and the drive. They would split everything 50-50. But before they could leave, Charles had to solve a problem that had killed every cattle drive before: food. See, a cattle drive took 3 months, maybe 4. You had 20 men working 18-hour days. They needed to eat. But how do you feed 20 men in the middle of nowhere for 4 months? There were no restaurants, no supply stops, nothing. Previous drives had failed because cowboys got too weak to work, or they deserted because they were starving. Charles thought about this for weeks, and then one night he had an idea that would change history. Charles bought an old Army surplus wagon, the kind they used in the Civil War. Then he rebuilt it from scratch. He added a wooden box to the back with a hinged lid that folded down into a table. Inside the box, he built compartments, drawers, shelves, each one designed for specific supplies. One drawer for coffee beans, one for flour, one for dried beans, one for salt pork, one for medical supplies. He added a water barrel on the side. He reinforced the wheels to handle rough terrain. He created a boot on the back to store heavy iron pots. When he was done, he had created the world's first mobile kitchen. He called it the Chuckwagon. Chuck was slang for food, and this wagon could feed 20 men for 4 months straight. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's just a wagon. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. Every cattle drive after Charles Goodnight used the Chuckwagon, every single one, for the next 50 years. And today, food trucks, mobile catering, outdoor kitchens, they all trace back to Charles Goodnight and that rebuilt army wagon. The man wasn't just solving his own problem, he was creating an industry. He just didn't know it yet. But in 1866, all Charles cared about was keeping his cowboys alive long enough to reach the market. The Chuckwagon would do that. Now, all he had to do was survive the trail. June 1866. Charles Goodnight, Oliver Loving, and 18 cowboys set out from Fort Belknap, Texas, with 2,000 cattle. They weren't taking the obvious route north, too many Comanche, too many hostile territories. Instead, Charles had planned something different. They would go southwest first, into the desert, then cut northwest through New Mexico, then up to Colorado. It was longer, much longer, but Charles believed it was safer. The first week was easy. Good grass, good water. Cowboys were joking, laughing, talking about what they'd do with their pay. Then they hit the desert. The Llano Estacado, staked plains. 96 hours with no water. I want you to understand what that means. 2,000 cattle, 20 men, 20 horses, 4 days under the brutal Texas sun with nothing to drink. The cattle started going crazy on day 2. They could smell water somewhere, miles away. They didn't know where, but they could smell it, and they wanted it. Keeping them together became almost impossible. Cowboys worked in shifts, circling the herd, pushing strays back, trying to keep the animals calm. By day 3, cattle were dying, just dropping where they stood, eyes rolled back, tongues swollen, dead. Charles pushed forward. What else could he do? Turn back and die in the desert they'd already crossed? Or push forward and pray there was water ahead? On day 4, they found the Pecos River. And that's when things got worse. The cattle smelled the water from a mile away. 2,000 panicked, dehydrated animals stampeded toward the river at once. Cowboys tried to control them. Impossible. The herd crashed into the river. Cattle trampled each other to get to the water. Some drowned. Some were crushed. When it was over, 100 cattle were dead on the riverbank. But the rest had survived. Charles Goodnight had done what everyone said couldn't be done. He had crossed the desert. But the journey wasn't over, and the worst was still coming. The first drive was a success. They sold the cattle in New Mexico for a massive profit. Charles and Oliver were rich men. They came back to Texas as heroes. In 1867, they set out again. Another 2,000 cattle, another dangerous journey. This time, they knew the route, they knew the water sources, they knew the dangers. They thought they were ready for anything. They were wrong. Halfway through the drive, Oliver Loving got impatient. They had buyers waiting in Colorado, and Oliver wanted to ride ahead and secure the deals. Charles told him not to go. Comanche territory was too dangerous for a small party. But Oliver was 55 years old and stubborn. He'd survived 30 years on the frontier. He wasn't scared of Indians. Oliver took one man with him and rode north. 3 days later, Charles got the news. Comanche warriors had ambushed Oliver and his companion. The companion escaped. Oliver didn't. When Charles found him, Oliver was barely alive. 22 arrows had hit him. 22. His arm was shattered. Infection had already set in. They were hundreds of miles from any doctor. Charles did what he could. They amputated Oliver's arm with a hunting knife and a saw. No anesthesia, just whiskey and a leather strap to bite on. Oliver survived the surgery, but the infection spread. Gangrene, black flesh creeping up his body. Oliver Loving knew he was dying, and he had one request. "Take me home, Charlie. Bury me in Texas, in good soil, not out here." Charles held his friend's hand and made a promise. "I'll take you home, Oliver, I swear." Oliver Loving died that night, and Charles Goodnight faced a choice. He was in the middle of nowhere. He had 2,000 cattle to deliver. He had 18 cowboys dependent on him, and he had a dead body that would rot in the summer heat long before they reached Texas. Any reasonable man would have buried Oliver where he died, said a prayer, moved on. Charles Goodnight wasn't reasonable. He was loyal. Charles had Oliver's body sealed in a tin casket loaded with charcoal to slow the decay. He completed the cattle drive, delivered the herd, got paid. And then he turned around and carried Oliver Loving's body 600 miles back to Texas. He buried his friend in Weatherford, in good Texas soil, exactly like he promised. Most men would have quit after something like that, lost their taste for the trail. Not Charles. Oliver's death didn't break him, it forged him into something harder. Charles threw himself into work, more cattle drives, more trails, more money. But he wasn't just collecting cash, he was building. In 1876, Charles partnered with a wealthy Irish investor named John Adair. Together, they created the J.A. Ranch in the Texas Panhandle, 1 million acres. Let that number sink in. 1 million acres, one of the largest ranches in American history. Charles ran it with the same precision he ran his cattle drives. But Charles didn't just build a ranch, he created systems. He created breeding programs that improved Texas cattle. He established the first serious conservation efforts for the American buffalo, saving the southern herd from extinction. He pioneered new ranching techniques that became industry standard. He trained a generation of young cowboys who went on to run their own operations. By the time Charles Goodnight died in 1929, at 93 years old, he had transformed American ranching. The broke cowboy who couldn't afford his own cattle drive had become one of the wealthiest and most respected men in the American West. And it all started with one simple idea. Buy a cow for $4, sell it for $40, and have the courage to walk through hell to make it happen.
What made Charles Goodnight different? He understood arbitrage before anyone used that word. Buy where it's cheap, sell where it's expensive. Simple concept, hard execution. He solved problems instead of complaining about them. No mobile kitchen existed, so he invented one. He chose loyalty over convenience. 600 miles with a dead body, because a promise is a promise. He turned tragedy into fuel. Oliver's death could have ended him. Instead, it made him unstoppable. And he built systems, not just success. The trails he blazed, the techniques he created, the people he trained, they lasted long after he was gone. Charles Goodnight started with nothing but an idea and the guts to execute it. $4 to $40. The math was simple. The journey was hell, but he made it. What's your $4 opportunity? What's the thing everyone says is impossible? Maybe it's not. Maybe it just needs someone crazy enough to try. Subscribe for more stories of cowboys who built empires. I'll see you in the next one.